Number 1. Timothy Wayne Krajir was 63 years old when investigators finally put a name to a set of cases that had haunted several states. When he was identified on August 29, 2007, he was already an Illinois prison inmate serving time for sex offenses that stretched back decades. To people who crossed his path, he could seem calm and unremarkable. To law enforcement, he was a repeat predator with a history of escalating harm. He was born Timothy Wayne McBride in West Mahanoy Township, Pennsylvania. His father left when he was still an infant, and his mother later remarried. He was legally adopted by his stepfather and took the surname Krajir. Accounts of his youth describe early theft and sexual boundary violations, and later reports noted a troubling fixation on his mother. As a teenager, he enlisted in the United States Navy, but he was dishonorably discharged after a sexual assault, a marker of how quickly his behavior crossed dangerous lines. Krajir entered the Illinois prison system on a rape conviction in the early 1960s. After later releases, he repeatedly returned to custody for sex crimes. During a brief window of freedom in the late 1970s and early 1980s, he was on parole and enrolled at Southern Illinois University Carbondale, studying criminal justice and psychology. Investigators later believed that education helped him anticipate police thinking and move through communities without drawing attention. Between 1977 and 1982, 9 women in Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania were killed in attacks that at first looked unrelated. The victims varied in age and background, but many were targeted when they were alone. Investigators say Krajir often noticed a woman in a public place, followed her long enough to learn where she lived, then returned later. He would enter a home and wait, relying on surprise and control rather than speed. Some victims were killed by shooting others by strangulation, and the shifting methods made the cases harder to connect. In Cape Girardeau, Missouri, multiple killings shook the community, including the murders of Mary Parsh and her daughter Brenda, and later Margie Call and Mildred Wallace. In Carbondale, Illinois, college student Deborah Shepard was killed in her apartment just weeks before graduation. In Marion, Illinois, the death of Virginia Lee Witte remained unresolved for years. Families lived with the same unanswered question: who did this, and why them? The turning point came when advances in DNA testing linked Krajir to a cold case and triggered a broader review. Confronted with the match, he confessed to multiple murders and also admitted to sexual assaults in which victims survived. During court proceedings, reporters described him as emotionally flat, while he answered to the charges even as relatives spoke about decades of uncertainty, fear, and guilt. In Illinois, he was sentenced to a total of 80 years in prison for murders connected to Deborah Shepard and Virginia Lee Witte. In Missouri, he pleaded guilty to 5 murders and additional charges, and the court imposed consecutive life sentences under a plea agreement that avoided the death penalty. He remains incarcerated at Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois. Number 2. Michael Adam Carneal was 14 years old when he walked into Heath High School in West Paducah, Kentucky, on the morning of December 1, 1997. He was a freshman, socially isolated, and easy for many adults to overlook. Friends and classmates later described him as awkward and withdrawn, someone who seemed to carry embarrassment and anger without knowing where to put it. To most of the town, he was simply a kid going to school. Behind that ordinary image, investigators and mental health evaluators later outlined a pattern of serious instability. Reports described anxiety and depression, but also severe paranoia, an intense fear that he was being watched or judged. Those beliefs shaped his daily behavior and fed a growing sense that the world around him was hostile In later proceedings, clinicians discussed diagnoses on the schizophrenia spectrum. At a parole hearing decades later, Carneal said he had experienced delusions and heard voices, and he said therapy and medication in prison helped stabilize him. There were warning signs in his actions, too. Authorities found that he had gained access to firearms and ammunition, and that he brought a .22 caliber pistol to school in his backpack. Witnesses also recalled troubling comments about something big happening, but at the time those remarks were dismissed as talk, not a real threat. That morning, students gathered in the lobby for a brief prayer circle before classes, a routine that made the space feel safe and familiar. Carneal walked into that group and opened fire, killing 3 students and wounding 5 others before the attack ended. The students who were killed were Nicole Hadley, Jessica James, and Case Steger. The survivors faced long recoveries and emotional trauma that did not fade when the headlines did. For families, the first hours were a frantic search for information calls to hospitals, rushed drives across town, and the unbearable wait to learn which children would be coming home. In a community where many people knew each other, grief arrived with names, faces, and empty desks. Witness accounts and later summaries say Carneal surrendered to the school principal, and he was taken into custody that same day. Prosecutors moved to have him tried as an adult, and the case quickly became a collision between accountability and mental illness. In court, he admitted what he had done through a plea of guilty but mentally ill, and the conviction covered 3 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, and first-degree burglary. He was 15 years old when the court accepted that plea in October of 1998. In December of that year, the judge sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. When parole eligibility finally arrived, survivors and relatives returned to tell the board what the crime had cost them over a quarter century. After hearings in September of 2022, the Kentucky Parole Board denied release and ordered him to serve out his sentence, meaning he would not receive another parole hearing under that decision. In November of 2025, Kentucky corrections officials moved Michael Adam Carneal to the Little Sandy Correctional Complex, where he remains incarcerated for the Heath High School shootings. Number 3. Marco Allen Chapman was 30 years old when he attacked a family in Warsaw, Kentucky, on August 23, 2002. He wasn't a masked stranger. In a small community like Warsaw, Chapman was a familiar name, an occasional laborer who had done small home improvement work and spent time around people connected to the home. That familiarity made the shock feel sharper because the threat didn't come from far away. By the time of the crimes, Chapman already had a serious criminal record. Prosecutors later treated him as a persistent felony offender, reflecting prior convictions and repeated contact with the justice system. Court filings also referenced a history of mental health concerns and substance abuse. After his arrest, later that day in West Virginia, the Kentucky Supreme Court noted that Chapman talked about going into the woods to die, and he asked an officer to shoot him, words that sounded less like an escape plan and more like self-destruction. Inside the home were Carolyn Marksberry and her children 7-year-old Chelby Sharon, 6-year-old Cody Sharon, and their older sister 10-year-old Courtney Sharon. The Kentucky Supreme Court's summary of the case states that Chapman entered the house intending to rob Carolyn, and he also sexually assaulted her. He attacked her with a knife, then went after the children. Chelby and Cody were killed. Courtney was injured, but she survived. In a later interview, Courtney described running to a neighbor for help while her family was still inside. The neighbor called 911, bringing emergency responders quickly enough that Carolyn lived, though she was critically hurt. For the survivors, the moment didn't end with the sirens. It became a permanent before and after marked by grief, medical recovery, and the pressure of being known nationwide for the worst day of your life. Chapman didn't stay on the run. He was apprehended later that same day in West Virginia. Court records and an Amnesty International case summary report that he gave authorities detailed statements about the attack. With the suspect in custody and the outline of events already emerging, the case moved into a different conflict, not over who was responsible, but over what justice would look like. What followed was unusual, even in capital cases. Chapman chose to plead guilty and volunteered for the death penalty, seeking to waive a jury trial and limit further litigation. The trial court ordered repeated competency evaluations at the Kentucky Correctional Psychiatric Center. A psychologist testified that Chapman had mental health issues but was competent to stand trial. When Chapman wrote the judge asking to fire his lawyers, plead guilty, and be sentenced to death, the court ordered further evaluations and hearings before ruling that he could make those decisions. In December of 2004, the court accepted the plea agreement and imposed a death sentence for the murders, along with additional sentences for related charges. National reporting later described Chapman resisting efforts to stop the execution, while others argued his choice resembled suicide by court. The Kentucky Supreme Court affirmed the conviction and sentence. On November 21, 2008, at age 37, Marco Allen Chapman was executed by lethal injection at the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville. Number 4. Said Ali Biad was about 42 years old when he walked into Louisville Metro Police Headquarters on October 6, 2006, and told officers that his family was dead. He was a Somali refugee who had recently lived in Oregon, and people around him described a quiet man who struggled with English and kept mostly to himself. In Louisville, his family was part of a close immigrant community living in the Iroquois Homes apartment complex. From the outside, it looked like a household under strain, but still ordinary enough that neighbors didn't expect what would come next. In the weeks and years that followed, the case became defined not only by loss, but by questions about Biad's mental state. Court records and later reporting describe paranoia and grandiose beliefs, claims that people were after his money, that he had status and wealth he didn't actually have, and shifting stories that didn't match reality. The legal process slowed for years because the court repeatedly examined whether he was competent to stand trial. Investigators said the violence grew out of conflict at home, centered on a marriage that was breaking apart, and arguments about the children. Biad and his wife Fatuma Amir were estranged, and police and prosecutors believed the pressure of separation and control, combined with his unstable thinking, pushed him toward a catastrophic decision. The victims were his 4 children: Sidi Ali, 8 years old; Fatuma Ali, 7 years old; Khadija Ali, 4 years old; and Goshani Ali, 2 years old. Police went to the apartment after Biad's statement and found the children dead along with Amir, who had been badly assaulted but survived. A deputy coroner later described the children's deaths as knife-related injuries. The details were deeply painful for the community, especially because the children were known at school as gentle, bright, and well-liked small lives that had barely begun to unfold. From the start, the investigation moved quickly because Biad surrendered on the same day and gave more than one statement admitting responsibility. Later, he reversed himself in court, offering an alternative story that blamed unnamed men and described being threatened into silence. The judge ultimately weighed those contradictions against the physical evidence and the earlier confessions. Biad chose a bench trial, meaning a judge, not a jury, decided the verdict. His defense centered on insanity. A psychiatrist testified that Biad was schizophrenic and unable to fully understand the criminality of his actions at the time. The prosecution countered with a psychologist from the Kentucky Correctional Psychiatric Center who testified that there were no signs of psychosis during interviews on the day of the killings. The judge found Biad guilty of 4 counts of murder, as well as additional convictions, including attempted murder of his wife, rape assault, and tampering with evidence. On June 9, 2011, Saeed Ali Biad was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, receiving 4 life sentences, 1 for each child, and he remains incarcerated in Kentucky. Number 5. Sean Windsor was about 40 years old when the killings happened in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, in the days after Christmas of 2003. He wasn't a stranger to the family. He was the estranged husband of Betty Jean Windsor and the father of their young son, Corey. By that point, the marriage was collapsing in public view. Betty Jean had pursued a protective order, and the relationship had already drawn police attention for domestic violence. To people around them, it looked like a separation defined by fear paperwork, and a man who refused to accept that the marriage was ending. In the background was a pattern of escalation. Court records show Windsor later pleaded guilty not only to murder, but also to violating a protective order and to felony theft charges that reflect a home life already governed by legal boundaries. Reporting at the time also described him struggling with substance abuse and instability while he was on the run, and in the years leading up to trial, his mental health became a central issue. Evaluations arguments about depression and concerns about how clearly he understood the consequences of what he was doing. The murders occurred inside Windsor's apartment at York Towers. Betty Jean and Corey had planned to visit him. When they didn't return, relatives grew worried, and police were called to check on them. What officers found turned a family crisis into a citywide manhunt. Betty Jean Windsor, in her late 20s, and Corey Windsor, 8 years old, were dead. Investigators later said the killings involved a kitchen knife, and a heavyweight details Windsor himself admitted in court when he pleaded guilty. Windsor disappeared immediately afterward, taking Betty Jean's car. For months, there were few solid leads, and the search expanded beyond Kentucky. Authorities later said the abandoned car was discovered in Nashville, and that the attention around it generated tips. Windsor was even featured on the television program America's Most Wanted, a sign of how urgent the case had become, and how badly investigators needed the public's help. On July 15, 2004, United States Marshals arrested Windsor in Shelby, North Carolina, where he was working at a junkyard. Extradited back to Louisville, he faced capital charges. As the case moved toward trial, his behavior continued to raise alarms. On the scheduled trial date in July of 2006, he took an overdose of prescription medication and required hospital treatment. The court held a competency hearing days later, with psychiatrists offering competing views. The judge ultimately ruled him competent to proceed. Just days after that ruling, Windsor stunned the courtroom. Against his lawyer's advice, he announced he wanted to plead guilty and asked to be sentenced to death. During the plea hearing, the Kentucky Supreme Court later noted that he repeatedly stated his desire to accept responsibility. A sentencing hearing followed in October, and the judge found aggravating factors, including that multiple deaths occurred and that a protective order was in effect when Betty Jean was killed. On November 17, 2006, Sean Windsor was sentenced to death in Jefferson County, Kentucky, and he remains under a sentence of death in the Kentucky prison system. Number 6. Sherman Noble was a Louisville native and a Vietnam veteran. By the time he became the focus of a major homicide investigation, he was in his mid-30s, and people close to him had already seen a long pattern of instability tied to mental health and the criminal justice system. The accusations against Noble centered on a short, intense period in Jefferson County, Kentucky. Investigators said he knew the men who later became victims, familiar faces he had been welcomed around before. That detail mattered because it meant the danger didn't arrive as a stranger at the door. It arrived as someone recognizable. In late July of 1985, prosecutors also linked Noble to the shooting death of Michael Edward Cox, a 24-year-old man. Reporting at the time described it as the result of a long-running feud expanding the case beyond robbery and toward personal conflict. Then came March of 1987. Authorities said Noble robbed and killed Walker Wendell Eisen, age 40, Charles Thompson, age 71, and Lorenzo Harris, age 87. The attacks happened separately, but within days of each other inside the victims' homes. Police and prosecutors described the method as blunt force and the pattern as direct entry into a private space, a sudden fatal assault, and property taken afterward. What made the case even more unsettling was what came after. Noble's partner at the time, Deborah Cork, told investigators he spoke in a mix of religion and retribution, describing people around him as snakes trying to cross him. In later accounts, Noble acknowledged confessing, but insisted it was forced, describing intimidation, mistreatment, and desperation during interrogation with early interview material reportedly missing from the record. Instead of moving quickly to trial, the case became known for delay. In the late 1980s, Noble was declared incompetent to stand trial and spent years in mental institutions. Amnesty International later reported that he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and that he was not found competent until the late 1990s. Even then, litigation and competency battles stretched on, turning the timeline into something almost unimaginable for the victims' families and the wider community watching the case unfold. When the case finally went to trial in the early 2000s, Noble was convicted of 3 counts of murder, along with related robbery and burglary charges. The legal outcome was split. Reporting described death sentences tied to 2 of the killings and a life sentence for another. A key controversy was that Noble served as his own defense counsel, and he attempted suicide on the day of sentencing, appearing in court in a wheelchair. Sherman, Louis Noble remained in custody and died of illness on October 1, 2007, before the state could carry out the death sentence. Number 7. Billie Jo Smallwood was in her early 30s when a late-night fire tore through her family's on-base housing at Fort Campbell, a United States Army installation that sits along the Kentucky and Tennessee line. She was an Army spouse and a mother raising 3 children, while her husband, Wayne Smallwood, served as an Army specialist. Friends later described her as deeply religious and devoted to her kids, the kind of woman who kept family photos close and spoke often about faith and motherhood. But behind that public image, prosecutors argued there was a marriage in trouble and a growing sense of pressure. Investigators and court records portrayed a household dealing with conflict money stress and resentment. The government's theory was stark that Smallwood planned a fire in an attempt to kill her husband, end the relationship, and collect on his life insurance policy valued at $400,000. Smallwood denied that accusation, insisting she loved her family and had nothing to do with the fire. In the early morning hours of May 29, 2007, neighbors reported flames at the Smallwood home. Firefighters arrived to find Billie Jo and Wayne outside with their youngest child, Nevaeh. Inside were 2 other children, Sam Fagan, 9 years old, and Rebecca Smallwood, 2 years old. Despite rescue efforts, neither child survived. Billie Jo was taken for treatment of severe burns and Wayne escaped through an upper window injured when he jumped. In an instant, a family that had gone to sleep together became the center of a tragedy that spread across the entire base community. The investigation quickly focused on whether the fire was accidental. Federal prosecutors and Army investigators said the evidence pointed to an intentional blaze. At trial, the government presented records showing Smallwood purchased a gasoline container roughly 12 hours before the fire. Investigators testified that remnants of that container were later found inside the home in an area where gasoline had been poured and ignited. Authorities also raised concerns about the home's smoke detectors and the condition of entry points, arguing the scene did not match a simple household accident. As scrutiny grew, investigators said Smallwood tried to steer suspicion away from herself. Prosecutors argued she fabricated a story about a threatening phone call meant for her husband, describing it as a setup by an unknown enemy. Phone records, they said, did not support her claim. A fire expert also challenged Smallwood's account of when she first noticed flames, testifying that her description suggested she was present at the moment the fire began. A federal grand jury indicted Smallwood in November of 2008, and she was arrested days later. The case dragged through years of pre-trial litigation, then finally went before a federal jury in Paducah, Kentucky. After a 9-day trial, jurors returned a unanimous guilty verdict. The charge was malicious damage and destruction by fire to property owned by the United States, resulting in death. In December of 2012, a federal judge sentenced Billy Joe Smallwood to 25 years in prison. Number 8. Lily Stanton was 48 years old when Winchester police began investigating the deaths of her daughter and her toddler granddaughter on May 20, 2012. She lived in Winchester, Kentucky, in a home she shared with her daughter Danelle Corey Stanton, who was 23 years old, and Danelle's child Cadence Ray Myers, who was about 22 months old. To outsiders, it was a multi-generational household that seemed built around family grandmother, mother, and child under one roof, leaning on each other through everyday life. But court records and police reporting suggested the home was carrying a heavy private tension. Investigators said Stanton was consumed by fear about a custody and visitation dispute involving Cadence's father. According to an arrest citation described in local reporting, Stanton told detectives she believed Cadence's father was about to receive more visitation time, and she felt cornered by the possibility of losing control over the child's future. That fear wasn't presented as a sudden spark. It read more like a slow build, an anxious spiral that hardened into a decision. The same documents described Stanton saying she did not have the money to leave the area with the child. In her own words, she framed what she planned to do as a twisted form of protection, not from danger in the moment, but from a legal outcome she could not accept. Police say the killings happened inside the home. The method, according to court records referenced by multiple outlets, involved a knife. Stanton later admitted to investigators that she cut both victims' throats. Reporters noted she described moving her sleeping granddaughter away from the main rooms of the home before the attack. Then placing the child back in bed afterward. Details that even without graphic imagery reveal a chilling level of planning and emotional detachment. Afterward, police said Stanton tried to take her own life. Officers found her alive but seriously injured, and she was transported to the University of Kentucky Medical Center. Investigators later said she could not be interviewed immediately because of those injuries, but when she was able to speak, she confessed. She was placed under arrest and booked into the Clark County Jail soon after. As the case moved through court, Stanton initially entered a not guilty plea. Over time, prosecutors sought the death penalty, and the case became a high-stakes legal fight shaped by grief, fear, and the question of intent. In January of 2014, Stanton changed course. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder, a decision that spared her a capital trial, and according to reporting, avoided the death penalty. On February 20th, 2014, a judge sentenced Lily Stanton to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 9. Stephen. Rob Nunn was 56 years old when Amanda Ross was killed in Lexington, Kentucky on September 11th, 2009. Nunn was a former Kentucky state legislator, a one-time statewide political candidate, and the son of former Governor Louis Nunn. After years in public office, he held a senior role in Kentucky's Cabinet for Health and Family Services. To many people, he looked like a polished public servant, well-connected, confident, and accustomed to being heard. Ross was 29 years old. She had dated Nunn, become engaged, and then tried to end the relationship. Friends and family later described her as determined to move forward, even as she took the breakup seriously enough to seek court protection. Earlier that year, after an assault in Lexington, Ross obtained an emergency protective order. Nunn was placed on administrative leave from his state job, and he resigned not long after. The separation didn't bring peace. It brought paperwork orders, restrictions, and boundaries that only matter if the other person accepts them. Investigators and reporters later described classic signs of escalating domestic violence, stalking fixation, and a refusal to let the other person live independently. Police documents described Nunn as depressed in the days before the killing. In an account tied to his arrest, he told investigators he was at the end of his rope and wanted revenge. The emotional mix is familiar in these cases. Control slipping away, humiliation, anger, and desperation paired with access to a firearm and a belief that the rules no longer apply. On the morning of September 11th, Ross was outside her townhouse at the Opera House Square complex in downtown Lexington when she was shot. The setting was ordinary, the timing brutal, the start of a workday, a quiet parking area, and then a moment that left neighbors stunned and a family thrown into sudden grief. Ross's mother, Diana Ross, later said her daughter had tried to use every legal tool available, but the threat still reached her front door. Nunn left Lexington and drove south. Later that same day, authorities found him in Hart County at a cemetery where his parents were buried. Reports said he had injuries to his wrists. When officers approached, he fired a handgun, and he was taken into custody after a tense standoff. Along with the murder case in Fayette County, prosecutors filed additional charges connected to endangering police during the arrest. The case drew national attention because of Nunn's public image. While in office, he had backed domestic violence legislation, and prosecutors treated the murder as an aggravated case, in part because a protective order was in effect. As the criminal case moved forward, Ross's family pushed for stronger protections for victims, arguing that restraining orders needed real enforcement, especially warnings when a restrained partner is nearby. There was no trial. On June 28, 2011, Stephen Rob Nunn pleaded guilty to murder with aggravating circumstances. A judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with an additional sentence for violating the protective order. He remains incarcerated in Kentucky under that life without parole sentence. Number 10. Wesley Neal Higdon was about 25 years old when the Atlantis Plastics shooting happened in Henderson, Kentucky, in the earliest hours of June 25, 2008. He was a factory employee, a press operator working an overnight shift at a plant where dozens of people were still on the floor and in the break areas. Born in 1982 and living locally, Higdon was not a stranger passing through. He was part of the workforce someone co-workers saw regularly, even if they didn't truly know what he carried beneath the surface. In the hours leading up to the attack, police said the tension centered on conflict at work. Reports described an argument with his supervisor tied to workplace rules, wearing safety goggles, and using a cell phone on the line. Company officials said he was escorted out of the building a moment that likely felt like public humiliation in front of the people he worked beside. Investigators also said he made a phone call to his girlfriend beforehand, warning that he wanted to kill his boss. She did not alert anyone, and the night kept moving forward as if the threat was only anger being vented, not a plan taking shape. What happened next unfolded quickly and with terrifying clarity. The rampage began shortly after midnight, with reports placing it around 12:20 in the morning. After being escorted out, Higdon returned with a handgun, a .45 caliber pistol, then shot his supervisor outside the plant's doors. Authorities said he then went back inside, moving from one area to another, firing at people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, in a break room on the plant floor, in the ordinary spaces where workers paused for coffee or finished a task before heading home. 5 co-workers were killed, and 1 additional employee was wounded and survived. The victims were Kevin G. Taylor, his supervisor, and 4 co-workers, Joshua Hinojosa, Trisha Mireles, Israel Monroy, and Rachel Vasquez. Several were from the small nearby community of Sebre, where churches and families overlap and news travels fast. Local clergy spoke publicly about spending the day with relatives who were trying to absorb what had happened, while the wider Henderson area, described in national coverage as a close town along the Ohio River, struggled with the same thought someone you might have passed in the grocery store had just shattered multiple families in minutes. Because the attacker did not flee the investigation in the usual sense, began at the scene confirming identities, tracing the timeline, and trying to understand the trigger. Police and reporters focused on the workplace dispute, the warning phone call, and how the weapon entered the situation. Questions followed about security policies and whether anyone could have recognized the danger earlier, especially in a setting where people often assume a heated argument will cool down once someone steps outside. No trial ever came. On June 25, 2008, Wesley Neil Higdon died by suicide at the Atlantis Plastics facility after killing 5 co-workers and wounding 1.